Good morning. As you can see from my fabulous outfit, I'm about to start painting. But this past week, I sat in on a grief literacy workshop. I just started a course on bereavement, and so this was part of it. And some of what was being presented was so helpful that I wanted to share what I could remember. And I'm sorry that I have already forgotten some of what was being presented, so you're not going to get as much information as they gave me. But I just hope and pray that something I say might be helpful for you, especially if you are recently bereaved. The one thing they did say was really everybody, to some even a minor extent, is familiar with bereavement and grief, because grief is what occurs involuntarily in the body as a reaction to a severance of attachment. So even a child who loses a toy and cries, they've lost something, so they have these experiences with grief. And of course, as we go through life, then we run into bigger losses, loved ones, but it's the severance of any attachment, and sometimes those attachments, they weren't even necessarily healthy. They weren't necessarily people. You can have a loss of status, of finance, health. There can be a loss of an expectation of what life was supposed to look like. And so all of these events or losses, they need to be dealt with because we have a need for attachment. Excuse me. Just like we have a need for food. And so what the presenter likened this cycle of attachment and loss and grief to was both birth and digestion. Because both with birth and digestion, something needs to be pushed out in order for there to be something put in. Like you can't eat more food without pooping out what's no longer nutritionally available or beneficial. So in the same way, when we have an attachment and then there's a severance, she called it, we have to metabolize that loss so that we can make room for the next attachment. And I thought that was a really interesting way of framing it, especially because some foods are harder to digest than others, and you can't be like, oh man, I haven't had a bowel movement within 7 hours after eating that food. We're like, well, you don't get to choose, right? Like, some things are just harder to digest. And there can be this expectation for people, no matter how big the loss is, to get over it in a timely manner, because your grief is uncomfortable for me. And this is something that really, when they said this, I thought, okay, this has to be repeated. She said, your whole life, when you hear of people talking about labor, what's the one thing that comes to mind? It's pain. Labor is painful. So if your whole life, okay, labor is going to hurt, and then you yourself or the mother of your child goes into labor, the very first contraction is like, oh, that is so painful. It's way worse than I thought, but everyone said it was going to hurt, so this must be normal. I'm okay. But now, what if our whole life we told women, like girls growing up, labor, it's this beautiful experience, it's magical, there's some changes that are going to take place, but you're going to enjoy, it's going to be a process that's beautiful. And then when that first contraction happens, what's her reaction going to be? It's going to be, something is wrong, I need help, I need a doctor. And that's kind of what we do with grief. We don't like to talk about it. We don't like to deal with death. We have the funeral homes in the hospitals deal with it, and we really sterilize it instead of saying, actually, grief hurts so bad. And not just hurt, there can be a whole wide range of manifestation. Some people, they don't feel anything and they go quite numb. In others, it's a rage or just an emptiness or, everything in between. And just like a woman doesn't get to say, well, I think I'm going to labor at home for 2 hours, then I'm going to go to the hospital, I'm going to push for 45 minutes and have my baby. Like, you get what you get. You get what your body does in that process. And in the same way, we don't get to choose how our grief is going to manifest itself. And as an outsider looking in at someone else, we can't say, well, wow, their grief is way out of proportion for the loss, because it's an involuntary response to the severance of an attachment. So, what can we take from this? Well, the first thing is we don't get to choose how long it takes. And however, there should, just like in birth or with digestion, there should be, even if it's slow, emotion. And sometimes it might not be very perceptible, but emotion. And the other thing is there needs to be a community in storytelling. Storytelling is so important to help with the digestion of the metabolizing of the attachment and the loss of that attachment. So that's why support groups for people who've lost things is so important. That's why it's important for us as friends or just colleagues, even of people who have gone through a loss, are willing to listen. And here's another thing too, like we wouldn't look at a laboring woman and go, wow, she's doing that wrong. We can't do that for someone who's grieving because it's so individualized. Now, I can say to someone, here's some things that I found helpful when I was in labor, or here's some things that I found helpful when I was grieving. Maybe they might help you, but it always has to come from a place of humility, because even if you think you're going through the exact same experience as they are, you're not. There's too many factors that play into how you're going to have these reactions. And now there's this other, it's called disenfranchised grief. And what it is when you really aren't necessarily allowed to grieve, maybe because of societal pressures, or because you really, you shouldn't have had the attachment to begin with, or it's just not seen as something that's worth grieving. For example, and there's so many, anytime that you feel like you can't grieve, it's not legitimate, it's disenfranchised grief. But it could be even something like someone's having an affair and their lover dies. Well, you shouldn't have been attached to that person. Or you already have 5 children and you have a miscarriage. Well, you already have all those children. Or you're super rich and you lose half your fortune. You're still well off. Well, who cares if you lost your fortune? You're better off than me. But those people are still going through losses. So what do you do with that? Because you have no community and you have no outlet for storytelling. And I asked this question, what do these people do if they can't tell their story? And her recommendation was find an online support group if possible, people who are going through the same thing, or where you can remain anonymous. And because there is an importance to work through what you've experienced. And so I found that all quite helpful. So if you feel like I feel like I can't get over this, maybe a better question is, are you seeing even this much movement? Because if it's even this much movement, then you're still going in the right direction to metabolizing the loss. And also, there is no timeline. No one can say, well, by 5 years, you should be fully over that. How can you say that? Because that's just as dumb as saying, well, you should have this baby out of you by 6 hours. We don't say that. Does grief ever get to a point where someone isn't going to work through it? Absolutely. And I in no way want ever to make anyone feel like they shouldn't ask for help. It's important to have someone come alongside you. And if you feel like you can't get that with the people around you, then absolutely, let's find someone who can, in a professional way, help you through that process of working through it. But I just want to say, hey, maybe we need to have a new dialogue about grief, one that doesn't just say, it's going to be upsetting, you're probably going to feel denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance, and it's going to be linear. No, it's like there's a myriad ways that it can come out. And if you are even just listening to this, finding yourself on the verge of tears because I have struck a chord with where your heart is and where your struggle is, then I wish so bad I could hug you and just know that you are loved and understood, and what you're going through is normal for the human species. And if in some way it's possible, I hope you're having a great day, and I hope that you're smiling.